I have been working on building bridges between Jews and Christians for over 20 years. And I know that the evangelical Christian community is a true friend of the Jewish community.
This is Bishop Robert Stearns. I'm here on Mount Zion in Jerusalem. The Mount of Olives is just behind me. And Solidarity Sunday 2025 was an incredible coming together of Jews and Christians standing in solidarity together, declaring never again. I want to invite you to join me as you hear the speeches, the testimony, the witness firsthand of Jewish leaders who are standing strong and proud in the midst of attack, in the midst of this rising anti-Semitism. They are raising their voices, and we are forming a wall of protection around them. Join me as you hear their amazing stories.
It's really an honor to introduce our speaker tonight, Rabbi Chaim Steinmetz, who happens to be my rabbi, and he is the rabbi of Kehilas Jeshurun, which is one of the oldest Orthodox synagogues in New York. There's lots here on his bio, but what I really want to talk about is that he has been an amazing partner in our mission at Moral Hearts since day one. He introduced us to Bishop Stearns, and on a conference call, we all brainstormed and came up with this idea of Solidarity Sunday. He believes in the mission of bringing our two communities together, and so it's just an honor and a privilege to introduce him today, Rabbi Chaim Steinmetz.
Eagle's Wings, under Bishop Robert Stearns' leadership, has created something remarkable: a Jerusalem-centered ministry which builds bridges to Israel and the Jewish community. And it's always great to work with Robert. And actually, we were just on the phone with Bishop Stearns, and I know that he is so interested in what we're doing here this evening. And I know that this will only grow from here. You may notice the necklace that I'm wearing. And this is actually says, "Bring them home now." There are 91 hostages still held by Hamas. And the conditions are horrific. I spoke to one of the former hostages who was only there for 40 days, and she described how horrific it is. And now these hostages are nearly there for 480 days. And so we pray that they should come home, that God should bring them home immediately, bring them home now. And finally, one other point that just touched me, and I did get the notes on what's happening this evening, but I just want to talk about how sometimes these coincidences, these connections are just happen, and you realize that there's something larger than we even envision. You know, earlier you said the mourner's Kaddish, which is the traditional Jewish prayer that you recite when someone has passed away. And so for a parent, you recite it for 11 months after they pass away. And then you recite it every year on the anniversary of their death. And you were reciting this, and I said to myself, you know, back in New York before I came here, I led the evening service. And it is actually the anniversary of my father's death. And so I recited the mourner's Kaddish. And these sort of coincidences are something larger than all of us can imagine. And so we were meant to be here this evening. And that's what I want to talk about, because Orthodox rabbis don't come to speak at churches all that often. And we're not invited to speak all that often, to be honest. And the question is why am I here? So I want to tell you my story, and I want to tell you how I got here by referring to 3 different verses in the Bible. The first one is from Psalm 44, and I'll read it in English. "It is for your sake that we are slain all day long, that we are regarded as sheep to be slaughtered." In Psalm 44, David is crying to God. He wants to understand why he and the good people have been abandoned. And David asks, why are good people being led as sheep to slaughter? And actually, my story begins right there. Tomorrow is January 27th. It is the International Holocaust Remembrance Day and was designated as such because it is the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz by the Red Army. My late mother, Rachel Steinmetz, was in Auschwitz. She had grown up in a small town outside of Cluj, Romania. During World War II, that region was under Hungarian rule. In the spring of 1944, the Nazis pressured their Hungarian allies to send the Jews to concentration camps. So my mother, her father and my grandfather, Mayer, and my grandfather was a widower, and my mother's two sisters, Relly and Lily, were sent first to a ghetto. And I need to mention one thing about their time in the ghetto, which I'll come back to later. Zsuzsika, a non-Jewish Hungarian woman who was very well connected in terms of government, and whose husband was actually my grandfather's business associate, snuck into the ghetto, despite it being a danger to herself because no outsiders were allowed in the ghetto. And she offered to save my grandfather and my mother and her two sisters. As my aunt put it, Zsuzsika was a woman of the Lord. But my grandfather refused her help because he couldn't imagine leaving behind his brother in the ghetto and some of the elderly members of his community who he worried wouldn't be able to survive on their own in the ghetto. He wanted to stay back for his family and friends. And then a few months later, my grandfather, my mother, my aunts were deported to Auschwitz from the ghetto. The three sisters were considered to be strong, so they were sent to what's called satellite camps that were around Auschwitz, where the healthier inmates were worked to death. Actually, my mom, for all of her life, had constant problems with her legs because of all of the difficulty she had standing and walking in the winter. And just before the Red Army arrived to these camps and to Auschwitz, the Nazis did what they could to prolong the suffering of the inmates. They took the vast majority of them on what was later called a death march, away from the front lines. And so in the bitter cold, my mother, my grandmother, and my aunts marched from Poland to Germany. My grandfather died on this death march. My mother and her two sisters were doing their best to keep up. At a certain point, my Aunt Lily, and just to give you a sense of their ages, they were teenagers. And so my mother was 16, her younger sister Lily, we use the Hungarian name Lycsi, was 14, and they're three teenagers. And they realized Lily is too weak, she's not gonna make it through the death march. And so the three sisters decided to make a run for it. And they were lucky enough to make it. The guards chased them and they managed to hide in a crevice and they got away from the guards. And they hid in a farm where a kind man found them. And from there they were given food and safety for all of the days that it took until the Red Army arrived and they were liberated. But so many didn't make it, including my mother's aunts and uncles and cousins. Entire families, entire villages of Jews were wiped out. 6 million were murdered. Now, during those dark years, there were questions. Like David, they wondered how God could allow this to happen, how they could be taken like sheep to the slaughter. The Nazis inflicted their destruction with a maximum of hate. Unlike my Aunt Relly, my late Aunt Relly, who was a family biographer, My late mother didn't talk about her experiences. She wanted her children to live without the burden of knowing the trauma that she had carried and to be, as she would put it, happy not to know these terrible things that happened to her. But one of the few stories my mother did tell was this. One day, she saw a mother and daughter speaking to each other through the barbed wire, which represented different sections of the camp. The Nazi doctor there, and there were many doctors who worked with the Nazis, whose job was to select who would be murdered immediately and sent to the gas chambers and who would be sent to work, watched the mother and daughter speaking. And then he pulled out his revolver and shot the daughter right in front of the face of her mother. And my mother would always say she could never get over how calm and content the Nazi looked after this ghastly murder. The years after 1945 were difficult ones. Over 1/3 of the worldwide Jewish population had been wiped out, and even today, there are fewer Jews in the world than in 1939. Many, and I know many of the survivors, many had their faith shattered. Others lost their belief in God, but they continued to build Jewish community. They would even come to synagogue because they were not willing to surrender to what the Nazis had did, and they were determined to keep going. And still others, like my mother, held tight to their faith. And I remember my mother praying at home, morning and evening, never missing a moment of prayer. Now, there were many questions. How could God allow the innocent to suffer? 1.5 million children were murdered during the Holocaust. What happened to the covenant that God had made with the Jewish people? And would the Jewish people have the will to continue forward? It is here where the world watched a remarkable biblical prophecy come true. And here is the second verse. In the 37th chapter of Ezekiel, God tells the prophet to go to a valley that is filled with dry bones and to prophesy to the bones and tell them to come back to life. And so they do. The bones become human beings. And then God tells Ezekiel, "Son of man, these bones are the people of Israel. They say, our bones are dried up and our hope is gone. We are cut off." And then God continues to Ezekiel, "Thus says the Lord your God, behold, my people, I will open your graves and raise you up from your graves and bring you into the land of Israel." And in 1948, that prophecy came true. Jews had always dreamt of living, or had always lived in the Holy Land, and those who did not dreamt of moving there. By 1947, there was a well-organized Jewish community in Israel with international recognition that they would have the right to build a future Jewish state. But the neighboring Arab countries declared that they would destroy the state the day it was declared. Goliath was on the warpath, and many thought that the state of Israel would collapse immediately. David Ben-Gurion, who was the founding prime minister of Israel, asked Yigal Yadin, the head of the Haganah, which is the forerunner of the Israeli army. So he asked Yigal Yadin, "Can your troops withstand the impending attack?" This is Yadin's response. He says, "If I wanted to sum it all up and be cautious, I'd say at this moment, our chances are about even. If I wanted to be more honest, I'd say the other side has a significant edge." The CIA analysis came to a similar conclusion. It was later declassified, saying, having been drawn into a war of attrition, Israel will gradually be defeated. But once again, David beat Goliath, and Israel won the war. And it was a miracle that came at just the right time for a nation whose heart had been broken. Hope had returned. The national anthem of Israel, Hatikva, the hope, actually takes its title from this passage in Ezekiel, basically saying we have not lost our hope. Even though some were saying in Ezekiel's time, we say we have not lost our hope. And each time we sing Hatikva, we are reminded of the miracle of the Valley of Dry Bones. And this is a large miracle built on many other smaller miracles. In family after family, survivors left the graves dug for them and rebuilt what had been lost. Let me repeat one account which my colleague Danny Gordis wrote about once, where he had met an elderly woman. And the elderly woman was 19 when her parents, who were in hiding, realized that she would never survive. And so they sent her to what was then mandatory Palestine to come and be with a sister because her parents knew they wouldn't live. And then she comes to Israel. She's actually interred by the British and then released. And 60 years later, she decides that she wants to take her family to see the places where she had gone when she was younger, to take them to like where her first apartment was and where she got her first job. And so she has a whole tour set out, and she tells her children, let's get a couple of cars, we'll bring the children and the grandchildren. And you'll see what it was like when I came here in the 1940s, during World War II, during the years leading up to the state. So they agree on a time and a date, and her son-in-law comes knocking on her door and tells her to come outside. She looks around, there's no cars, but there's a bus. The bus is filled with children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren and nieces and nephews. And as she put it, when she told Danny Gordis, she said, 6 decades later, she came to Israel alone, and 6 decades later, the family she created could barely fit into a bus. That is, in small order, the larger miracle of rebuilding after seeing the Valley of the Dry Bones. And my own mother, just to mention, is that she left a family of 4 children and 18 grandchildren, and those 18 grandchildren are continuing forward, and already there are over 20 great-grandchildren. But the miracle of Israel, and this is my final verse, it belongs to all people of faith. And it requires friends, it requires helpers. And the third verse I want to quote are the words of Joseph, actually just before he's sold into slavery by his brothers. His brothers are angry with him, they're jealous of him. He also is gossiping about them. But his father sends Joseph to his brothers out in the fields because his father understands that Joseph needs to reconcile. And Joseph seems to understand it as well. And he goes into the fields and he's searching for them and he can't find them. And then he has to turn to someone to ask for directions. And the Bible puts these words in because it wants us to recognize what Joseph is doing. And he turns to the man and he says, I'll say the Hebrew first, Et achai anochi mevakesh. I am searching for my brothers. And he continues to say, please tell me where they are. Now, Joseph doesn't reconcile then. He gets sold into slavery by his brothers. But 22 years later, they finally come together in love and forgiveness, and Joseph's quest is complete. And that is why I am here tonight. You are my brothers and sisters in faith, and I need your help. For centuries, we have stood apart. Jews carry the scars of centuries of anti-Semitism that was perpetrated by Christians in the name of Christianity. Because of this, there is distrust. Pastor Clem mentioned a visit to my synagogue just a few weeks ago. I had a group of close to 20 ministers along with Bishop Stearns in our synagogue. Afterwards, I got an email from a member who asked me how I could host Christian clergy, considering the history of Christian anti-Semitism. Now, I could understand her question, but this was my response. History isn't destiny, and we must always work to make sure that the future is better than the past. I explained to my congregant that I have been working on building bridges between Jews and Christians for over 20 years. And I know that the evangelical Christian community is a true friend of the Jewish community. Like Zhuzhika, who came to save my grandfather and his family, you are here for us, and we need you. Since October 7th, we have realized how alone we are. The United Nations spends all of its time condemning Israel and ignoring Hamas. Great powers like Russia and China support Iran and her proxies, Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis. But the United States has stood by its ally. It didn't do that because of the college professors and the students on campus. The United States has stood by Israel because of you, because of our Christian friends who understand us. And you understand us because you know that when they claim that Jesus was a Palestinian, that is a lie. Jesus and Mary and Joseph were Jews, or if I may use their Hebrew names. Jesus actually is a shortening of Joshua, Yehoshua, Yosef, Miriam. These are common Hebrew names. These are the names of the Jewish people. You know that when they claim that the Jews in Israel are settler colonials, that is a lie. All you have to do is read the Bible, which is filled with prophecies from Israel and prophecies about Israel. And most importantly, you know the difference between right and wrong. You know that Hamas is evil, that when a group beheads babies, rapes women, and burns people to death in their homes, that group is the very face of evil. And you have the moral clarity to understand that one must always choose good over evil. And this is why you have come to our side, recognizing that we share so much in common. And that is why I am here this evening, an Orthodox rabbi in an evangelical church, because you are my friends, you are our friends, and I am searching for my brothers and sisters. Thank you.
These stories, these testimonies are overwhelming. It's amazing to hear the strength, the perseverance, the resilience of the Jewish people. I want to invite you to join me and come alongside our covenantal older brother in faith, the Jewish community. You can do that by going to eagleswings.org and becoming a partner today. You can plant a tree in Israel in our forest of life, an amazing, amazing forest that literally the desert is blossoming as the rose. You can feed hungry Israeli families through our Abraham's Bread feeding program. There's so many different ways for you to be involved, but let me hear from you today. Make your best gift today and ask your church to be involved in next year's Solidarity Sunday. All of the information is there in the link. We are believing that hundreds and hundreds of churches are going to join together every year and understand that never again is now, and we have to be a part of that solution. I look forward for your prayers, your giving, your partnership, making a difference in this generation. Solidarity Sunday, be a part of it.